Welcome back to The Heat. We're talking about the resignation of U.S. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel and what it may mean for U.S. foreign policy. Joining us now from California is Stephen Zunes. He's a professor of politics and international studies at the University of San Francisco. Here with me in the studio in Washington is Cedric Leighton. He is a retired U.S. Air Force colonel and he's been deployed several times to the Middle East. Welcome, gentlemen, to both of you to the show. Cedric, let's start in Washington. Are you surprised that the Defense Secretary left his post less than 2 years after being in it?
I think the timing, Anand, is very bad for the United States in that there's so much going on right now. There's so many different things that are happening and so many different policies that had their start but are kind of in midstream, and there's no real finish to them. There's no real end where you can say, okay, I've tapped this off and I've put a bow on it and now I can move on to the next problem. And so that's the real issue. That Secretary Hagel was out of step with the administration is not a surprise. So the political aspect is not a surprise. The fact of the timing, to me, is a bit of a surprise.
Dr. Zunes, was Chuck Hagel the first casualty of what some in the media are saying was a very incoherent foreign policy that was articulated by the Obama administration, especially in this past year?
Not necessarily. I think a lot of the problems may be less political in nature, but more on an administrative side. I mean, Secretary Hagel would not be the first person who was a quite solid and competent legislator who didn't quite do as well in a cabinet post where you're responsible with a large bureaucracy. And of course, there's no bureaucracy in Washington bigger than the Pentagon. And he was also hired, I think, because they wanted someone who could focus on cutting back the bloated military budget and engage in restructuring and that kind of thing. They needed someone who would be a strong advocate as a Republican, someone who certainly is not soft in any way to counter some of the hawkish elements within the defense establishment. But not only did he not really take that leadership as much as I think many people in the Obama administration hope, but the Obama administration itself has had to refocus their energy on what appears to be fighting and even escalating new wars.
Cedric, are we perhaps placing a bit too much emphasis on the role that the Defense Secretary plays in the formulation of foreign policy? I mean, was Chuck Hagel always on message with the rest of the administration?
Certainly not. And, I'm not sure how much it was by design or how much it was that he was representing the Pentagon and felt kind of like a legislator, as the professor mentioned, more responsible for his constituents as opposed to being an articulate spokesman for the policy of the administration. So in many ways, it seems to me that he was looking at his role more as a representative of the military than as a representative of the administration. And that, I don't think he put into the right balance, at least not the right balance as far as the administration was concerned.
Right, and Dr. Zunes, if we look at the national security defense establishment or hierarchy here in Washington, where does the Defense Secretary fit into that hierarchy? Does it depend on who's sitting in that office?
In part, and a lot of it involves someone who is willing to take the kind of leadership. I mean, there is a tendency on one hand for the people to trust the generals, for the career officers who spent their entire life within the military, and there's some resentment if you have civilians who do not have that kind of background to try to tell them what to do. At the same time, there's certainly an institutional imperative, if you will, within the military establishment, just like in any other institution, where just that kind of leadership was taken. Again, the hope was that Hagel could be stronger in that area, especially since he is the first combat veteran to actually hold that that kind of office. But the but the main problem, I think, was that his he was not the kind of person who could really be that take that kind of leadership role.
We heard Michael O'Hanlon talk earlier on the show, and he was saying that he would like to see a military man take over as Defense Secretary, perhaps one of the retired generals right now. And I'm just wondering, what kind of impact would that have on military policy, say, in places like Afghanistan or the Middle East?
Well, it depends on the experience of that military person. There's been some historical precedent for that. For example, you had George Marshall, who not only served as the head of the Army, U.S. Army during World War II, but he was also Secretary of State and then later became Secretary of Defense. So that was back in the Truman administration. So there is some precedent for doing that. It is a bit of a role change, and there are a lot of different things that need to happen before that's an acceptable solution. But you definitely would want somebody who has a lot of experience with that and who understands that now they're a civilian as opposed to a military person, and as a civilian, they get to control everything in the Pentagon if they do it right.
Right, Dr. Zunes, I was looking at a piece in the Guardian newspaper which said that, we could perhaps see a more gung-ho policy from the new Defense Secretary, whoever that is installed, and whoever the President decides to choose. Maybe he wasn't getting that kind of aggression and forthright behavior from the last Secretary.
I think, if anything, it may have been the opposite, that there was hope that Secretary Hagel would push back more against some of the more hawkish voices. And from his confirmation hearing on, it appears he was unwilling to take on that role. Basically, the thing about President Obama is that while he is obviously as committed to our country's defense and safety as any president, he recognizes there's limits to American power, that we cannot continue being in these endless wars and these far-flung military bases and the expenditures that cost when our infrastructure at home is falling apart, when we have fallen from the top of the heap in terms of industrialized countries on many of the social indicators to falling far below our European and other counterparts. I mean, just basic things like education, healthcare, public transportation, housing, and the like. And again, we can't have it all. And we basically, I think there's the need, for people to recognize that, the more we've militarized the Middle East, the more we've gotten involved in these other countries, the less secure we become. And maybe we need to rethink the whole package.
Here's another view. Cedric, very quickly, we've just got about 40 seconds. John Pike, director of globalsecurity.org, that's a website that talks about military policy. He says from a military standpoint, the White House wants to do as little as possible until they're 2 years up. They just want to see this through.
Yes, I think that's probably pretty accurate, because they want to see it through. They don't want a major disaster, but they want to do it in a way that preserves their degree of power. And if they don't have a disaster, then in essence, they've won.
We're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. Dr. Steven Zunes talking to us from California. Cedric Leighton here with me in the studio. Thanks to both of you for joining us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. And to continue the conversation, join us on Facebook. That's at cctv_America. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.